We have here today Professor Paisley Livingston from Hong Kong, and I would like to start off asking you, how did you first learn about Professor René Girard?
Okay, so I was an undergraduate at Stanford University, and there were a couple of young faculty members who were talking about the work of René Girard. And so I read the English language translation of his book on the novel, which was in English entitled Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. I read that book sometime around 1972 when I was an undergraduate. And it turned out there was a little clique of undergraduates who were really passionate about that book. We talked about it a lot. It made a big impact on us. And these two junior faculty members were Paolo Braghieri, who was in the French and Italian department, and he taught a course on the history of drama from a Girardian perspective. And I and some of my best friends followed his seminar, and we were really excited about that. And then there was Josue Harari, who was also in the French and Italian department. And Harari published this little bibliography of structuralists and structuralisms and post-structuralism. And he sat me down one day over coffee and ticked the different important authors, and he mentioned Girard, of course. And at that time, Stanford was trying to hire René Girard. And at one point, it was announced that he was going to be arriving as a new faculty member at Stanford, but apparently he got a better offer somewhere else, and he never came to Stanford at that point in time. Of course, later, of course, as you know, he was hired by Stanford, but he actually accepted an offer from Stanford in the early 70s, but then changed his mind.
I see. So what?
Little known fact.
So where did he go at that point? I guess he went to
Well, it wasn't Hopkins at that point. I believe he was at Buffalo.
Buffalo. Right, right. So when did you then meet him?
Well, I went and lived in France for a while after I finished my BA at Stanford, and then I got admitted, luckily for me, to the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins. And I had agreed to begin my doctoral studies in the Humanities Center at Hopkins, not knowing that René Girard had been hired. And he started that same semester when I first went to Hopkins. So when I heard that Professor René Girard was going to be on the faculty at Hopkins, one of the first things I did was I went to his office and knocked on the door and said, "Hello, glad to meet you. Can I be your student?" You know, so that was a happy coincidence for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Providential more than coincidence, wouldn't you say so?
That's right. Yeah, could be. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. It certainly made a huge difference to my life and academic career.
So then what happened afterwards when you said you wanted to be his professor? So then what happened?
Well, he was great. He was always very generous as a teacher. You know, I think a lot of people perhaps don't know that. How could they know? But he was very supportive to a wide range of students, and not at all only those students who were especially interested in his ideas. He gave very genuine support to people who were pursuing other sorts of topics and other kinds of work. I mean, he was just a generous man.
Yeah. So were you doing your PhD with him?
Yeah, that's how it turned out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he was supportive. I think he probably thought maybe doing, because I was in the Humanities Center, and that was more or less a center for literary studies. Right. But he was supportive of the fact that I got interested in the films of Ingmar Bergman, and that was my thesis.
Right.
Topic. And I think he was really good because he was not a film studies person.
Right.
You know, but he supported that decision.
Right.
Because he was interested in Bergman and had given a couple of talks about some of the films.
Why was he interested in Bergman of all filmmakers?
Well, he felt that themes of mimetism and sacrificial violence resonated throughout the oeuvre of Ingmar Bergman, and that's true, right?
Right.
Although it's pretty clear that Ingmar Bergman never knew anything about René Girard.
Of course, right. Yeah. Do you remember any advice he gave you while you were a student writing your dissertation?
Advice? Well, he gave me advice about a host of, concrete issues that cropped up along the way. You know, you could talk to him at length if you so chose. I mean, he was an early riser. He would wake up in the wee hours and he would read and write. I think he said those were often his best hours.
Yeah.
And then so by the time it got to be mid-afternoon, he had he would be in his office, and he really liked it if grad students would drop by and just sit around and chat. You know, he really loved that. And so he would sometimes give you advice about intellectual and other matters just in the course of an afternoon. You know, he just liked to converse about new books and issues and range of topics, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
What about what is your how long did you know him after?
Well, that was really important for me. He didn't just supervise my PhD. He kind of drew me into a broad network of people, and so a lot of those people were really important for me in my career. So Jean-Pierre Dupuis came to Hopkins to visit René and talk to him a lot, and so I met Dupuis, and then subsequently Dupuis invited me to be part of his research institute in Paris, and there was Paul Dumichel, um, Franco-Ontarian philosopher who became a really close friend. And because I was in Canada for many years, got to know Paul very well, and we collaborated a lot, you know. So there was a whole Girardian network and an extensive network of other people who knew the Girardian network, you know. So that was really important to me. Yeah.
Yeah. And
So I knew René, you know, for decades. And I should also mention Martha, his wife, because she was always, you know, even when I was a grad student at Hopkins, she was always very warm and supportive and was very kind on some occasions when I visited Stanford, you know. So it was more than just a kind of professional relationship, you know, teacher-student relationship. Yeah.
can you tell me perhaps one or two good memories you have of René Girard?
Well, there's so many, it's hard to pick out any one thing, but maybe what I'd like to say in this interview is that, and some people may not have known it, René had a wonderful sense of humor. He was incredibly witty, and he could come up with these remarkable witty things on the spur of the moment. I could give you one example of that if you're curious.
Sure, please.
So you probably know there was this colloque de Cerisy conference around his work held at a beautiful castle in Normandy, and the talks were held in this beautiful old library. And up in the front on the left, there was an old couch. And after lunch, René would sit on that couch, and there would be, you know, one talk after the next up in front there. And sometimes he kind of nodded off. And during one of the breaks, some audacious and I think somewhat cheeky person came up to him, and we were all standing around in a group, and he said, "Professor Girard, I've noticed you've fallen asleep a couple of times during our lectures. Is it because the lectures are so very boring, sir?" And he said immediately, he said, "Quite the contrary." And everyone was like, "How can that be?" And then he immediately, and he came up with this just on the spur of the moment, this flashing wit. He said, "Well, you see, you people are giving all of these brilliant talks about my work. And at the end of the week, I'm going to have to answer. I'm going to have to respond to all of these criticisms and queries that you're raising. And it's keeping me awake at night. I can't figure out what I'm going to say about all of these questions. And so I'm not sleeping. But when I sit there on that couch and someone starts another one of these interesting lectures, it takes my mind off my worries, and then I fall asleep. It's because the talk is so interesting that I fall asleep." And that he came up with that so quickly was just so marvelous, and it was hilarious.
That's wonderful.
Just one example.
That's
so
wonderful.
so very witty. It comes out in the writings too, I'm sure.
Right. No, very good. Now, tell me, of all the books of René, which is your favorite book?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it goes back to the first book that I encountered. The mimetic psychology interested me a great deal. I mean, I was also interested in La violence et le sacré, the violence and the sacred. I thought that was a fundamental book, you know, so, but those were the two great works. Now, I did some translating of various articles as well, which many of which I thought were just great.
So Deceit, Desire, the novel, and Violence and the Sacred.
Yes. Yes.
What do you think of? Everybody talks about things hidden since the foundation of the world.
They do, yeah. And I did some kind of editorial work on the English language translation of that book as well. So obviously I thought it was important. But I'm not a religious thinker. So I was less interested once he made his kind of religious turn. I became personally less interested.
I see. I see. Uh, did you read his last book,
No, I haven't read it.
Battling to the End?
No.
No. Okay. So, and how long did you keep in touch with René?
Oh, I don't know exactly. We had correspondence now and then for quite a long time. Yeah. Sorry, I don't really recall exactly.
Okay. Very good. Alrighty.
I was living in Montreal for many years. Then I moved to Denmark. And then in 2001, my wife and I moved from Denmark to Hong Kong. So I wasn't getting around to California as often as I had previously when I was situated in North America. I think the last time there was a conference, I was invited to a conference at Stanford on rationality and the human sciences. And I went around and saw René and Martha on that occasion. That was quite a number of years ago.
Yeah. Did you go to cover at all? Cover conferences?
I've never been to a cover conference.
I see.
No.
Okay.
No.
Did you at all get introduced to Andrew McKenna and Sandra Goodhart?
Oh, yes. Now, Sandy, I met really a long time ago. There'd been a conference at in New York somewhere, and several of the graduate students at Johns Hopkins went up to that conference, and that's when I met Sandy. And then I taught for a year at the University of Michigan. I had a one-year appointment at the University of Michigan, and Sandy was a faculty member at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, so got to know him quite well. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. And then there were various conferences back at Stanford after René moved from Hopkins to Stanford. There was the Order and Disorder conference, and then there was the one Understanding Origins, and so I went to both of those conferences, and Sandy was there as well. So there was a whole network.
So when you were at and John Hopkins, who were your classmates?
Well, Tobin Siebers was a really close friend of mine, and he was also René's student.
Right.
So, and then there were a lot of interesting doctoral students in that cohort. But there were also a lot of interesting intellectuals from France who were flying in and teaching many courses. So it was really kind of a who's who of French theory, because we had Jean-François Lyotard and we had Louis Marin and Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe. There was a very strong interest in deconstruction at Hopkins at that time. And then, of course, later, René started inviting Michel Serres to come to the camp, to Hopkins a lot. So all of us got to hear Michel Serres and talk to him as well.
I see. Very good.
Yeah.
I hope to meet you sometime soon.
All right. Thank you.
When you come, thank you so much for
doing
your time and doing this, sharing your conversations, memories with today. So
okay.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. See
Have
you.
a good. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.